fundamental misunderstanding of the economic system, and also as a reason why demand redistribution has not increased in line with inequality as the Mel's Richards theorem said it would. And this level of misperception has also given rise to a large experimental literature. That kind of the starting point is essentially, is information the problem? If people knew where they truly fell within the income distribution, would they have a different set of preferences? And the way to look at this has been to run survey experiments, correct people's misperceptions, and see if that changes their beliefs and preferences. I mentioned like lots of different countries have been fragmented upon, and there have also been some cross-national comparisons involving multiple different countries. And all this literature shares a kind of common rational choice, underlying assumption that people's preferences should move in line with their self-interest. But it also shares two kind of less explicit assumptions. First of all, that the national income distribution is observable. And secondly, that the national level is the kind of natural or default reference, such that if you correct people's misperceptions relative to the nation, this acts as a state of shock or confrontation that could be expected to change people's beliefs and preferences. So this is kind of relative deprivation theory and reference group theory, essentially. But we think these two assumptions could potentially be challenged on two different fronts. First of all, is the national income distribution observable? And here you have a map of median household income in the US in 2023. US P50 was $77,700. But as you see, there's an enormous range from just over $25,000 in Randolph County, Georgia, former plantation area apparently, to nearly $180,000 in Loudoun County, probably not pronounced like that, Virginia. So if you're in a place that's kind of on the very blue or reddy orange colour, actually you're living in a place where the local income distribution really looks nothing like the national one. And indeed, having the median national income of $77,000 would put you in the middle quintile in less than half of all the 3,000 US counties. So maybe it's possible that the national is not observable, and people's kind of some of the misperception that exists at the local level reflects the fact that people kind of live in very different circumstances, observe different things, and so on. So that's kind of one of the areas of challenge, we think. And then the other one would be around the national reference group assumption. So of course, national identities are powerful, but at the same time, we're all embedded in multiple levels of social relations, the local country level, groups, societies, institutions, etc., etc. There's a long history of psychological and sociological research on reference groups that shows that people form kind of perceptions of where they fall relative to proximate reference groups as well as more distant ones. And in this sense, you could think that maybe if you correct people's perceptions relative to a more proximate, observable, knowable group, that this might have a larger effect on their beliefs and preferences, because it might induce a stronger sense of relative deprivation. Maybe you know some of these people, maybe you feel kind of harder done by if you find out that they are richer than you. And kind of in combination, this is also the implication of two recent papers by economists in this space. So Hidberg et al. Find that people are somewhat better at positioning themselves relative to more proximate reference groups in Denmark. And Zhu et al. Find that more proximate income corrections have a large effect on income and wage satisfaction in Finland. Of course, very different contexts. But these two kind of assumptions and our belief that maybe these could be challenged in some way led us to our two research questions that we addressed in this project, which are more or less, are perceptions of local income rank any more accurate than national income perceptions? And then secondly, do local income corrections have stronger effects on inequality beliefs or preferences than national income corrections? And more or less, our hypotheses are that yes, we think perceptions of position in the local distribution should be somewhat more accurate. And secondly, that local income corrections might have a larger effect on preferences, beliefs than national corrections. Because of this reference group, we kind of knowability thing, maybe the sense of relative deprivation is stronger. And we test these by running a pre-registered survey experiment in the US. This was June last year. And why should we study the US? So of course, we all know the answer to this question. But at the same time, it's worth thinking briefly about, in the context of these two other papers on kind of similar topics in the Nordic countries. So of course, the US has much larger spatial income inequalities. This is the same map that you've seen before, but where income is, county level median income is indexed to the US average. This level of variation does not exist in Finland or Denmark. So you have much wider spatial inequalities, and you might think on that basis that the US is kind of a most likely case for our first question, that maybe people see different things at the local level because it deviates so much from the national level. But then in terms of the second question around the what effect corrections have, well, the US is of course known increasingly, unfortunately, for the kind of hyperpartisan element. So you could maybe think that perhaps people's beliefs are really fixed and that little kind of income treatment is not going to change anything. Maybe preferences are not so malleable in this context. And this is, there hasn't been a single country study of the US so far, but the US was included in these two cross-national comparisons. I mentioned earlier, and both Hoy and Major and Bublitz find that national income corrections have null effects in the US. So maybe in terms of our second research question, it's actually a least likely setting to find that income corrections kind of do change anything. In terms of survey design, we used a company called Donata, who have a panel. Respondents were required to be over the age of 18 and to live in the US. We had quotas for age, sex, broad geographical region, and initially also for kind of broad income group, but we ended up relaxing these quotas. The local was defined as the 3,144 US counties. This was for both disclosure and identity-based reasons. So in terms of disclosure, we were asking people to give us their location within the US. We could potentially have gone one level down to zip code, but we were worried that people would be more concerned about this. And there's lots of research that uses counties. These are kind of local government units. They have a meaning, and they also have a, particularly in the rural parts of the US, they also have a kind of cultural or like identity component. And this is what we wanted. We wanted the correction to hurt as much as possible. So that's why we went with counties.
Do you mind taking questions throughout?
No, not at all.
So I'm wondering if could you do sensitivity checks as well? Because Los Angeles County is huge.
Los Angeles County is huge, it's 1 million, but the median population across the different counties is 25,000.
Okay.
So yeah, they're not as big as they might seem. Los Angeles is actually an exception rather than the... But yeah, there is massive variation in population size. And then we defined income position by the American Community Survey, which is quintiles. So that's what we use to kind of define people's true position in both the local and the national income distribution. Yes.
Is that survey representative at the county level?
No.
But it gives you enough information to do the position at the county level?
So is the American Community Survey representative? Yes.
It is.
Yes. And there's margins of error around the kind of income sums, but yeah, it should be a very good guide.
Sorry, Kate, one more method. Sorry.
Please.
Sorry, because you mentioned partisanship, where you've worried at all about the partisanship and survey bias.
So we asked them to give us their political position on who they were planning to vote on. It doesn't seem to be doing much, but yeah, it's, you know.
I just had an idea that came up in connection with the first question about the county size, whether you could make use of that. Because if that was the case, then you would expect, based on your theory, to find more an effect in smaller counties rather than the big ones where the reference could. Probably you do that in the second slide.
It's good.
Yeah.
So within our survey, respondents were randomised in advance to 3 treatment groups. So 2/5 to the local treatment, they received information about their true position in the county income distribution, 2/5 to the same, but at the national level, and 1/5 to the control, so no information about where they actually sit. And just to give you a sense of what this looked like, so it's kind of people selected their state and then their county from drop-down boxes. They disclosed their pre-tax household income, and we tried to tell them what we what household income was and how to kind of estimate it. They then received a little explanation about the societies and income ladder, what this means, and only then they then see this graphic on the right. So this is for Twin Falls, Idaho, which is where Catalina Verijoa is from. And again, there's another kind of little explanation of societies and income ladder. People are asked to position themselves both locally and then nationally. That order was randomized. And one important thing to say is that the slide always started at 1. So people had to move it. And this is a slight spoiler alert, but on the basis that almost nobody selected 1, we know that people did actually engage with the exercise, which is of course useful. And then the treated group, so this would be a local treatment for somebody living in Twin Falls, Idaho. This is the information treatment. So we use colours, we use words, and we use pictures to try and kind of reinforce the treatment. We also refine this a little bit, having piloted the study on a small scale. So essentially they were told, you said here, in fact you're here. And because most people were wrong, again, spoiler alert, there were lots of corrections of income position.
In both directions, corrections.
Yes. And so for the United States, it would be, for the people in the national treatment group, it would be the same, but it would say the United States instead. And then there was a validation question, followed by the there, of course. And we also made them wait a little bit. I think it was 5 seconds before they could click through. Again, as part of trying to reinforce the treatment. Lots of validation failures, of course. Roughly 60% passed validations, both the local and the national.
Clarification. When you're doing comparisons, are you doing real or nominal?
Sorry, say again?
When you're doing comparisons across different numbers, are you doing it in real income?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, and how do they understand real? When they're saying, when you're going to ask them, how do you think it's compared to the national distribution? So
It's on the first step is the poorest households, on the top step is the richest households. So it's clear that it's about money.
yeah.
What do you mean? You mean like,
And where do you think you are in the income distribution is one thing. Where do you think you are in the real income distribution? And I may not be in terms of what my income is, as opposed to what prices I face for housing and
Yeah, so we
standard of living.
yeah, we don't relativize. But yeah, we are aware of income differences, and this is also why we thought people might place themselves differently.
Like I'm as well off,
Yeah.
even though my income is here, I'm as well off as
Yeah.
guy in Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay, sorry.
Any- And then in terms of dependent variables, we asked basically a series of different ones in randomized order, usually measured on the temporal scale, in kind of 3 domains. One around economic perceptions, this is perceptions of income inequality and financial well-being. A couple of questions in the domain of system legitimacy beliefs, this is meritocratic beliefs and trust in movement. And the third set, the kind of classic question in this type of experiments, redistribution preferences, as well as how people would vote if they were asked to vote about tax rises for local and national services. And analytically, we just do simple OLS regressions with no controls, supported by balance tests. And at the moment, differences of opinion, of course, we're doing this with validated respondents only, because these are the ones we know kind of truly received treatment. So first up, are local perceptions more accurate? No. So you can really start seeing this from the descriptive statistics. So this is the proportion of people across the whole sample who correctly place themselves in the local compared to the national distribution. And as you can see, it's essentially 1/3 of people are correct at both scales. Americans tend towards the optimistic, and lots of people place themselves higher than they actually are. And then kind of just under 30% It's the other way around, so they think they're poorer than they actually are. But you see here that it's very similar at both the local and the national scale. You can also see this for descriptive statistics. So in the light colour, this is where people place themselves, and in the dark colour, this is where they actually are. You can also see that our samples skew poorer. This is because it's a consumer panel where they receive a small sum of money to complete surveys.
Yes. Let's take into clarification. And you're simply asking richer or poorer. And what, are you above or below? Not a good bit above, say 1 quintile above, 1 quintile below.
We tell them exactly where they are, but then when it comes to the experimental side, we group. So someone could be 2 steps wrong or 3 steps wrong. We would group those people.
And it's only 5, so it's only 5 numbers you have.
Yeah.
So in fact, if I'm guessing completely, there'll be 20% right, and you're getting 30% right.
I mean, what you can see at both scales is this kind of default to the middle. And we know this is a real default to the middle because the slider started at 1. So people have kind of actively selected the middle.
So I guess I think, can you do this? Can you calculate numbers which says super optimistic, super pessimistic?
And we can,
Meaning not just by a little bit.
yeah, we don't really have the power to do kind of more detailed. In an absolute ideal world, that was the question.
Yeah, sorry, you said the dark ones are the actual quintiles.
Yes, they're
Why,
actual.
so why is one quintile half the size of another one? The actual one, shouldn't they all be?
Because our sample skewed poorer because it's a consumer panel when they.
Oh yeah, you said you'd relaxed the, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so we started off with kind of idealized, let's try and get 20% in each, and it didn't play out that way. And again, so this is showing you that essentially national self-placement is a much better predictor of local self-placement than actual local self-placement. And maybe this is now kind of flogging a dead horse, but this is getting onto some comments about kind of real income and regional price differences. So you could think that kind of if the local is more observable, then a household with, say, let's say $50,000 worth of income in a poor county where $50,000 is kind of worth more in terms of spending and housing costs, etc., should place themselves higher in poorer counties and lower in richer counties. And we test this by running multi-level models in which we interact own household income with the county median. There is no interaction. So it's not a totally flat line, but it's almost a completely flat line. So households with a given level of income are not placing themselves differently depending on the kind of the county median. And then you could also think, and this is coming onto another comment, well, some counties are really large, like Los Angeles, some are much smaller. Again, perhaps observability is better in small counties, or among people who've lived there a long time, maybe there's a learning effect. And this we kind of look at in a slightly different way by looking at the probability of being correct at the local level, correctly placing yourself, so it's binary outcome. And what you can see, or hopefully see from the coefficient plots, is that no, neither of these things are true. So it's not the case that people are kind of more likely to be locally correct in small counties. And the learning effect among long-term residents. Actually, with the learning effect, it could go the other way. You could say maybe you need to move around different places in order to understand kind of income distributions. But essentially, there's not much happening. And by far and away, the best predictor of being correct at the local level is being in the middle. So people default there. Some people are correct, some people say actually are in the middle. And then there's the kind of big picture question that unfortunately there's nothing in our survey that can help us answer, which is this strong middle bias, which of course would be partly about social desirability. But when people are asked to place themselves and they rush towards the middle, is this driven by genuine belief? They really think that's where they sit, or is it that they just don't know? And kind of under pressure, it seems like the best choice. And of course, we've got 5 different things. The middle is really easy to find. Maybe if you had a 10-point ladder and people had to pick like at least above or below. But yeah, I think that's kind of we don't fully understand.
I'm wondering whether there's evidence about whether the wording of this makes a difference in the sense that poor and rich are connotations of very particular situations. So, you know, these people might not be poor, they might be in the bottom quintile, but they don't consider them to be poor as,
Yeah.
you know, you understand the word. They wouldn't consider themselves rich as the rich people that they seem to be. So there may be, you know, natural going to the middle. So I don't know whether the word plays a role in, or whether you could identify people who we could categorize as real, very poor,
Yeah.
or very rich in your survey to see whether these are actually, you know, positioning themselves correctly as well. So,
Find that very plausible. Kind of overall sort of bad news for hypothesis one, that the local, in this context, we thought where local might be more observable because there's such huge differences. Doesn't seem to be in the US, certainly not among our sample. But kind of mechanically, this is useful for the experiment because we end up issuing kind of almost the same number of corrections at the local level, at the national level, often in the form of telling people that no, in fact, they're not in the middle, they're somewhere else in the distribution. This is just to show you what you're going to see in the coefficient plots. So yeah, we have three broad treatment groups, but then we're interested in subsets of the treatment. Unfortunately, not quite as specific as we would have liked. But so what you're going to see is kind of the treatment groups that are locally richer than they thought, locally poorer than they thought, and then the same nationally, and all of these compared to the control. So you can kind of directly compare back to the control group, you don't receive any information, and then indirectly you can compare between the treatment groups. And the ones who are actually correct at the local or the national level, they're grayed out because we didn't formulate any hypotheses. And they're in the sample, but they're just not in the plots. So first up, in general, we try to replicate wording from existing large surveys like ESS and so on. So this is a very classic, you've got the question at the bottom, could you please tell us how serious the problem of income inequality is, first of all, at the local level, and then at the national level separately, order randomized. And there's not a huge amount going on here. So what you can see is that people who are informed that they're locally poorer than they thought, roughly kind of 0.4 points on the 10-point scale, more likely to say that local income equality and national income equality is a problem, just about crossing over statistical significance thresholds, but no robust effects elsewhere. But then, yes.
Sorry, just, so you did say that, but the zero line means the median of the control.
That's, yeah, yeah.
The median of the
Yeah.
control. And so what level is that, the 10-point scale?
I honestly can't remember, it's something like 6.5.
Thank you.
And here, this is meritocratic beliefs. This was a we kind of pulled two questions, but both in the space of hard work kind of pays off. Obviously, that's only one dimension of meritocratic belief, but it's used kind of relatively frequently to assess belief. And here you see kind of more distinct effects, both kind of all in the expected direction, locally treatments producing robust effects compared to the control group. So again, in the kind of 0.4 points on the 10-point scale. If you're told you're locally richer, that you express higher level of belief that hard work pays off, kind of logical, and vice versa. No robust effect among the nationally richer than thought treatment group, and then the nationally poorer than thought kind of mirroring for locally poorer than thought.
Regarding the previous slide, do you have the plot or have you looked at the differences per quintile?
No, not yet.
And one would hope, just to follow up on that one would hope that that's a much bigger effect. This is just the effect of learning something. That's what you're interested in this paper.
Yeah.
But in fact, the stylized fact must be something about how that varies across the actual distribution. If you're poor or if you're rich.
Yeah.
And you have that.
We have it. I mean, we're very much this project is inspired by the experimental literature, which is, does an information treatment cause changes? But yeah, more broadly, we have all these things, it's just not the focus of this particular.
Big question. So maybe it's related to that one, or with those one. I don't know if the effects are coming from misperceptions general or misperceptions about their own income. I mean, what would happen if you give information about a place, this random household income in the 1 to 5 scale? They also have misperceptions on that. Those graphs will look the same if you ask just get the question. I don't know anything about this. I'm just asking.
I think it's a really interesting idea. I mean, I think the reason it's developed as a literature where people place themselves is the idea that the treatment is supposed to hurt, and therefore it might change individual preferences. But you're right that there's a kind of, you could do it a different way. Maybe overall you'd expect slightly weaker effects.
Just so that personal beliefs about against income accuracy. I don't know. It's like
Sorry, quick one. What are the relative size of the groups of sort of people that are richer than they thought, people that are poorer? And if you sort of correct misperceptions in both these groups at the same time, sort of at a national level, is the effect just, well, the aggregate, there's no change because some people move in one direction and some people move in the other direction.
Sorry.
Oh, just one group is moving one way, the other group is moving the other way. If you add them together, it's just, we don't see anything that correct people's misperceptions.
Yes, but that's why the split.
Yeah.
And the theory is that finding out in one direction will have one effect, and finding out in the opposite direction would. So it doesn't always play out that way. And there's some argument about, are these effects not?
For the richer and poorer than thought, or correct, do you allow for something like, I don't know, like some uncertainty interval around their income to say if they are roughly somewhere around, between the 3rd and 4th quintile, and they say either of those, we count that as correct, or are you like being very strict with whatever they report and you have? We're
very strict with the borders, just mechanically, and then they can't waver, they can't pick 3.5, they can only pick 3 or 4.
Yeah.
But yes, they might be $1 over or under, and they would be categorized in such a way differently. And then lastly, redistribution preferences. So yeah, this is the classic, I can't remember if it's Will Valley survey or in social survey, but yeah, the government should take measures to reduce differences in income levels. And here you see it's kind of very similar pattern to meritocracy. We have effects among the 2 local treatment groups, nothing robust among the nationally richer than thought group, and in effect, kind of similar order of magnitude. And these are slightly larger. This is kind of more the like 0.6 scale points on the 10-point scale. I'm only showing you 3 of our 6 dependent variables in the interest of time. And across the 6, it's not the case that local corrections are consistently inducing larger changes in beliefs and preferences than national corrections, or indeed that either type of correction induces change across all the different domains we look at. And in fact, there's kind of limited and fairly inconsistent effects on perceptions of income inequality, perceptions of financial well-being, government trust, and also tax and service preferences. But local and kind of to a slightly lesser extent national income preferences do seem to induce substantial change in redistribution preferences and meritocratic beliefs, even in the hyper-partisan context of the US. So these are kind of, you would generally think these are relatively deeply held beliefs. Perhaps in advance, we'd have expected things like perceptions of local income inequality that are more likely held to be more likely to shift in response to an income correction. So we wondered why this might be, that kind of actually it's the deeper things that are moving more. And to look at this, we take advantage of the fact that we included a few questions also in the survey that were essentially designed to measure perceptions of income inequality differently. So these are 2 sets of questions at 4 different scales. My household, people I know, a lot of people locally, and a lot of people nationally are struggling to make ends meet. So kind of, yeah, doing really badly. And then the opposite. So lots of my household, all these different scales, are doing very well financially. And here are the coefficient plots from these questions. And this tells us lots of useful things. So number 1, the income correction, the treatment was received. Specifically, it was received at the household level. And these effects are large. This is sometimes more than a scale point on the 10-point scale. This is across the treatment groups. It doesn't really matter whether you're asking about seeing lots of wealth, essentially, or seeing lots of people struggling. But then you also see that there's distance decay, kind of as the scale ripples out. So there's some spillover from the treatments to how people report that people they know are doing financially, but not much spillover then to kind of local perceptions or national perceptions. So basically it's personal, it's shock. And when you think about it, it's perfectly logical that you're told, well, you're told something about yourself and your position, you're also indirectly told something about society, but the piece of information people are taking from this is where they sit, and they're not really kind of taking on board the stuff about society. And then what we found it useful to do is then to contrast the kind of the financial shock, what we see as the financial shock linked to the correction, and to then, so this is struggling to make ends meet compared to redistribution preferences. And what you can see that is not that surprisingly, the financial shock effect is kind of larger in terms of magnitude. But then there's some carry through to redistribution preferences, but more carry through, it seems, at the local level than at the national level. And a similar thing is true in terms of meritocratic beliefs. So this is the other question, just because they go in the same direction and it's a little bit easier to see. But yeah, so you receive the shock, it's at a household level, and then there's some carry through to how, well, what we're not sure about because we haven't done enough investigation is it some groups who are more affected? Can we kind of profile people? Or is it just that, you know, there's a shock of one order of magnitude and it's kind of like a necessary but not a sufficient condition for people to update their preferences and beliefs. So this we need to do more work on, particularly interesting ideas kind of in this space. But we think this has helped us understand why we have some results in kind of beliefs and attitudes that we would generally class as kind of fairly deeply held, and not so much in the space of kind of government trust, local income inequality, because these are not things that are kind of really touched by the treatment. And to sum up, so we started off trying to answer 2 different questions. Are perceptions of local income more accurate? And do local income corrections have stronger effects? And the answers kind of more or less are no, and kind of not universally no. But we think in very interesting ways. So it seems to be that the county income distribution among our sample is just as unobservable as the national income distribution. In this context where we thought, particularly the tails, you know, there's so much difference that it should be more observable. This was our kind of most likely context, we thought. Unfortunately, we can't say much about what's driving the kind of very strong middle bias at both scales, but we think it has some implications for the kind of broader discontent literature. So often what people do, and I've done this myself, you're looking at voting behaviour or preferences, and you throw in at the local level a control for median income. Well, if it's not observable, then it's probably not doing anything directly. Of course, you could still have indirect effects via, for example, tax revenues or so on. But yes, if it can't be seen, then it's unlikely to be having any direct effects on some of the domains we look at. It seems like both local and national income corrections have pretty large effects on perceptions of household well-being. So this is insight into the mechanics at the sausage factory, essentially, of income corrections in the experimental literature. We see there's some spillover to how this shock affects how people report on people they know, but very limited spillover to kind of broader spatial scales. And we see that there's kind of variable translation from this financial shock to other domains. Sometimes there's no translation at all. We think that's because the correction is not touching kind of wider perceptions. It's very much only affecting things where kind of the advantages associated with a different set of societal arrangements are very obvious to the respondent. But we can also see that there seems to be like relative bit more carry through from the financial shock with the local corrections compared to the national corrections, because the shock is universally received, but the local treatments are having more of an effect on these two domains, or a more consistent effect, you could say, than the national treatments. So this is a survey experiment. All the usual survey experiment caveats apply. We have no sense of how long these effects last, if they last, beyond exiting the survey. In an ideal world, we'd have had a bigger sample, perfectly representative, county level, all these things. Don't get that well, unfortunately. But overall, kind of, even with these caveats, I think it's fair to say that our results challenge the idea that the national context should always be, or always does function as the natural or default reference group, kind of in everyday life, but also in this experimental literature. That is the end, but just a thank you to universities of Constance and Lausanne for funding this, and thank you all for coming.
Some time for questions. Go, yes.
Really interesting case, thank you. I just wanted to actually go back to the original literature that you mentioned. I was wondering whether there are studies that have looked at this over time to give you an idea of whether perceptions of inequality have changed sort of in the pre and post social media age, whether people have become, essentially I'm asking, have people become more accurate over time?
Not that I know of. I think in general, it seems like, particularly in the experimental literature, which is of course only a subset of broader interest in perceptions of inequality, there's not been a huge amount of thinking about channels, how people are observing what reference group matters, and so on. Just sort of assumes that this thing is visible in some way. There's one really nice paper on the effect of a reality TV show that I can't remember the name of, that people who watch this show like truly believe in the American dream. But I think, yeah, the over time, I mean, there's very mixed evidence on the kind of Mills and Richards theorem. Is it? Some people say it's true and other people don't. Yeah, as far as I know, I don't think I've seen something that looks like.
Same question sort of applies to the political context as well. Like hypothetically, I'd expect Democrats to be more accurate than Republicans in the US context, but you're imagining it.
I think we have looked at this. I think in the end they're not so different within our sample. But because so many people are wrong, that's the thing. So because of this strong middle bias, and not everyone can actually be in the middle, there's a lot of people wrong, and that seems to be relatively even across political feelings. Double check.
That reminds me of when we did that Brexit paper years ago, and we had IQ data for Brexiteers and non-Brexiteers. Remember at the time, I think it was pretty best not to publish that. Yes.
Thanks so much. Got a couple of questions. First on the framing, or like why the US, right? And I was just thinking that in like there's a lot of literature that says, well, Meltzer Richard doesn't work and so on. A lot of these studies are in the US. And I was just thinking there was a recent study by Elkia and Iverson in the APSR, which said actually it works quite well. More inequality leads to more redistribution, with one remarkable example, which is the US. So that might be something well, yeah, because we have a lot of local. That might be something to maybe use in that setting. Second, I still want to come back to the big counties, because I thought you'd show subgroup effects for bigger and smaller counties, but you didn't, because my hunch would then be, if this holds, we would see stronger effects in the smaller counties, whereas the bigger counties almost, are more like a small country or whatever in that level. And the other one, always asking for subgroup effects. I was a bit worried about power in the end, because you have 7 groups, 2,000 respondents. If you have like 60% of 30 I was wondering, why do you throw out like 40% of the sample? You know, you could like throw in some kind of dummy that said, okay, has this been accurate or not? Or maybe have like a check whether the effect varies by being correct or not, but you just restrict yourself in an already limited sample environment. And then lastly, I would like to see whether, so you always have the control group as the reference group, so to speak. But your whole argument is about correction at the local level should have a bigger effect than at the national level. And I would like to see those being played with as like the treatment and the control group to see whether you have a statistical significance in those effects. Also, is the effect of local differences different to national differences?
I mean, subgroups is one of those things that, yeah, we really don't have the power. If you had 30,000 respondents, maybe, but yeah, I think we're a bit wary of going too far into it because you could find things that don't mean it. But yeah, no, I take the point about throwing away the non-validated. I didn't say that we also we included some open text boxes, and sometimes we know why people didn't validate because they wrote strongly worded objections to the correction, which in and of itself is interesting. It also touched on a comment earlier about so for example, someone who would be in the top quintile would say that would put me with the billionaires. Well, if you divide society into 5 groups, then yes, indeed, you would be with the billionaires. But that's touching on exactly the point from earlier that people don't feel that rich because they watch TV and they see celebrities and all these other things. So yeah, I think it's complicated. That's the
Well, I had a PhD student who did one of these information treatments on something else, and then went back and asked. So it changed things. It was about how their local places in India were doing, and you were asked beforehand what you thought. You were told actually this is much better. Then you were asked immediately. In his case, it wasn't about redistribution, but it was about did they understand the question? Did they now think something else? Yes, they did. But then he went back 2 months later, just 2 months, and it was all. So the whole point of this literature, presumably, is, I guess it's interesting to find out if people change their political beliefs. Or their beliefs about redistribution or for meritocracy or whatever. In some sense, I guess, particularly interesting if you say, well, it's a really cheap treatment. Just tell them where they are and look, they all vote for taxes. But has this literature tested whether the thing stays? You motivated, the concern in the US by the fact that people are partisan and so on. I wouldn't be surprised at all if you just tell them actually you're poorer than you think, it's not hard work after all. But then, 3 months later, I think it's hard work again.
I mean, I think that's a generous interpretation. I think you could even ask a question about 3 minutes after the survey. And the answer is, I don't think we really know. That's not. I think this literature is very much motivated by this cheap treatment and the kind of questions like, is information the problem? Would people act in their own rational interest if they just knew? And not enough looking at, the duration of effects.
So you don't know of any papers that do that?
I think there might be a couple, but it's not, I mean, I guess again, it's money. You have to be able to go back to the same people some period of time later, difficult to access.
You student manager have money to do it, I'm sure people can do it.
But yeah, no, I take the point that, and this is, I think, one of the major limitations of all this literature, is we just don't really know. It kind of, in some ways it's promising because yes, it implies that a good public information campaign could maybe achieve something, but it's almost like step 0 or step 1 in the process of mounting such a campaign, and actually it translating into different voting behaviour or different policy.
Thanks, Katy. 2 or 3 ideas and questions. So first, I understand that the validation leads you to exclude people only in treatment groups. So that's maybe, validate your randomization because you exclude those maybe with more radical or poorer. But then, if you exclude people only in treatment groups, then you exclude people only in treatment groups. So that means you validate your randomization because you exclude those maybe with more radical or poorer. But then, if you exclude people only in treatment groups, then you exclude those maybe with more radical or poorer. I don't know, but in any case, I wouldn't do it probably, and if you do, maybe show, what kind of people are excluded by treatment groups. That's one point. Second point, I wondered, I don't think you can answer this question, but maybe it's not that relevant, but I'm curious whether people just don't know what's the median income, or they just don't know how variable it is. Because both can be true, and maybe it has some implication, maybe it doesn't. And the third one, I don't know the literature, so maybe it's already been done, but potentially it could be more relevant to think of like professional groups as a reference point, like as an academic. I don't know that well how much people earn in, I don't know, let's say in other sectors, but I have a fair opinion of how much one can earn in academia. So maybe placing yourself there, this is what annoys people most and hurts more if you think you are richer or poorer within your professional reference group.
So absolutely take the point about validation and the randomization issue. At the moment it's the robustness, but we might end up switching into the main pieces, we'll see. So today people not in the middle or kind of the level of inequality? Well, it seems like both. So we've also looked at like, does Gini do anything? Like, seemingly no. So it seems like they don't know anything. It's kind of the broad takeaway. But one thing also to say is, so again, this is from the comments. Sometimes when people objected to the correction, it's because they have median wage markers. So these are some of the things people do know, that median wage is this much. But of course, the income distribution is not the same as the wage distribution. So the US has a large pensioner population, a large single mother population. So I think, again, one of the big picture things that emerges is like household income is a concept that doesn't travel that well in the sense that you know your own. And if you have employed friends, you can kind of guess if you know their jobs. But beyond that, there's a lot of knowledge and some confusion between income and wages. So yeah, that's another sort of big picture thing to take on. And then professional groups. So this is actually what this is in the 2 economics papers I mentioned. They use different groups, including, so the Finnish group, they run corrections relative to like people with the same educational level. I think people even in the same workplace, because it's Finland and they have registered data. And they do find, yeah, these more proximate corrections hurt more and change people's preferences more. That said, Finland is a very specific context where you can easily find out everyone's income by just voting someone up. But yes, definitely there does seem to be there's not been enough research, I would say, at different scales, but yeah, the closer scales do seem to hurt more.
Thanks, that was really thought-provoking. I had two short questions. One being, when do you know about your respondents' household composition? Because I'm assuming, is it equivalized household income that you're constructing to then compare to scale for correction? And I guess I'm asking that because is to emphasize that it's synthetic what you're doing with their income and then putting on the scale potentially. And then my second thing was, maybe one of the things to push in your conclusions is to what extent is a county level income correction a local income correction? If we're thinking about the actual process or mechanisms, is it not still quite similar to a national level where you're not seeing inside all these other people's homes or finding out about how much they spend on their holidays? Like, it's about living standards or other things about what you do with your money. So is one of the directions to push is what would a much more local version look like to compare to a kind of medium or national level group?
And so this household composition, we do know at the moment we're not using equivalized household income. Also because the placements weren't adjusted. So we thought it was better to stick with just raw household income. But yeah, we did ask for this reason about, who are you living with? How many people are earning? But both as like separate questions in order to try and get at this kind of as a robustness check. And then the scale question, Yeah, I think in some ways this is the $64,000. Like, what is the right scale? And probably it's a question more research is needed. I mean, actually in the US, it would be difficult to go hyperlocal because you just don't have the data. We didn't want to go down to zip code levels because people are not kind of emotionally attached to their zip code. There's at least some emotional attachment among some people to counties.
You'd be surprised about attachment to zip code.
Thanks for the great presentation. I had a reaction to the finding about it being surprising that there was more change on meritocratic beliefs. And a question that I had is that usually when I see meritocratic beliefs as system justifying beliefs measured in surveys, it's asking people's perception of the operation of the system when people's deservingness is essentially unknown. So you're applying your preconceptions about people's deservingness onto an unknown distribution. And in this experiment, you anchor people's perception within their own household. And it's kind of the opposite way around, because really most people see themselves as deserving because they see themselves as hardworking wherever they are likely to fit on the distribution. And so in a way, it might not be that you are changing people's system justifying beliefs in meritocracy, but you're anchoring their evaluation of meritocracy at the household level where their deservingness beliefs operate differently.
Point well taken. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question about the underlying channels. So our assumption is it's a fairness response, like particularly if you're told you're poor, this is not fair, and that's why it's triggering. But I mean, we're only looking at hard work, which is one dimension, meritocratic beliefs. Maybe it's the dimension that's much more likely to be triggered by this type of experiment. But yeah, noted.
I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of the beginning of your presentation, so I'm not sure, maybe you discussed this already. Is it about the challenge to a publicly stated belief of self that is important here? So if you have a control, let's say, where people didn't have to state first where they are positioned.
They did have to state.
Yeah, but I'm asking because it's a public statement, even if there's no individual sitting, about this is where I am, and then that belief gets challenged, you say like, but you're wrong, right? And then there's a change according to that, like you're actually worse than you thought you were, or in the United States, being poor might definitely be considered as being worse than you evaluated yourself, right? So I wondered if in the literature or if there's some kind of idea that the control could be not asking people about where they are positioned and then exposing them to information about, this is where you are positioned in real time, versus a condition where you would say, okay, people state it publicly, we don't do the correction, then we measure opinion, right? And the other one where you would have people who have both, because it could be a challenge to your perception of self, right? If somebody says, how nice, how loved do you think you are?
Yeah.
And then somebody says, actually, nobody really likes you, or, actually many more people like you than you thought liked you, what do you think about the world? Yeah, or about yourself.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it's a challenge to your perception of self that's quite public in a statement, or if it's something about actual information. That is yeah.
Sounds like a really great researcher.
Okay.
Yeah, go.
I have a general comment on the whole literature of perceptions. My question is, are we cheating ourselves with this? Because economists and social scientists have decided to use income as a proxy for something else just because it is simple or informative, or I don't know. For 75 years, we have used income, but we want to measure welfare. And we don't dare ask households about their welfare. So perhaps we are making a question and we get an answer about what we wanted to measure to see, which is the distribution of welfare. And households may decide to answer regarding their wealth distribution, their position of wealth,
the evolution of the neighborhood in which they have lived, because they may be doing better than the neighborhood, even if they are worsening up. So that's the question, is the whole literature makes conclusions, general conclusions, looking at one variable, which was just a side proxy. That's a general comment on the.
Neil?
Yeah.
If you want to follow up on a point that was made earlier here about household size or equivalent income, we could use household size as a control in some of the things. I mean, also related to Fakundu's latest point. I mean, if people are thinking of their quality of life, right? Their consumption, say, how well they're doing or something, then you'd expect a very large household and a single pensioner household to respond differently, and maybe the errors are actually not errors. Or, I mean, I'm being generous. I'm sure there are lots of errors, but it could be, right? And perhaps you can. We don't actually know what the equivalent scale should be, but by using just the household size as a control, you get a sense.
I think you always, probably this is the universal experience of running survey experiments, but you always regret not having asked some things. Like a life satisfaction type question is one of the things I regret we didn't ask as a very poor proxy for welfare. But yeah, it would be nice to know.
For instance, suppose that we live in a very segregated society, and I live for historical personal reasons in a neighborhood which is a poor neighborhood, and it has been got poorer. But I am not doing worse than the neighborhood. I'm doing better than the neighborhood. But I am poor. I will see myself as doing better than my local community. And if the local community is full of immigrants, I may be rejecting redistribution altogether too. So I want to say that this idea of wrongness about the conclusions may be debatable or may be challenged in some general context, right?
Almost at time. I'm just going to ask one really unfair question. So we're all here rather than watch Keir Starmer do his speech. And like it strikes me, I mean, from this whole literature, what is the implication? What does it mean for people like Starmer trying to get us interested and engaged in inequality? Inequality. Also inequality more, yeah.
Well, so confession, I didn't think this treatment would do anything, and especially in the US, and it did do something. So in some ways, I think that's quite hopeful that this silly little income correction in a survey setting, it seems can change some deeply rooted preferences. Okay, caveats about the duration of the effect, but I think it means that some kind of well-constructed information campaign could do something. So that would, yeah.
But if more or less the same proportion of people overestimate and underestimate the overall. They would not fully simulate.
I think we're at time. So Katy, thank you so much.